I'm Craig Blumenshine, and it's time for our weekly series, A Closer Look with the Monitor, where we examine the reporting shaping conversations across North Dakota from the North Dakota Monitor. Today, we're talking about immigration enforcement and the growing number of ICE detention cases now moving through federal court here in North Dakota. North Dakota Monitor reporter Mary Stoyer recently reported that emergency petitions challenging ICE detentions have begun appearing in the state's federal courts, part of a broader national surge tied to increasing immigration enforcement. And Mary, it's a pleasure to have you back with us today to walk us through what's happening, why it matters, and what it could mean for North Dakota.
Hello, thank you for having me.
What's changed nationally, Mary, that's leading to the increase in these detention-related lawsuits?
These lawsuits in North Dakota and elsewhere in the country pretty much all stem from a belief that as the Trump administration pushes to massively increase immigration arrests, detentions, and then deportations, that immigration agents are detaining people unlawfully.
So your reporting notes a 75% increase in ICE detention nationally over the past year. Of course, we've seen a lot of that just in the news that we consume. How does North Dakota fit into that trend?
So I haven't found state level data that's recent enough talking about detentions in North Dakota over that same time frame. It might be available and I just haven't found it. Although a lot of this data that's coming out of the federal government, there's kind of a lag to it. It takes a while to see what's happening on that granular level.
You do report that 7 emergency petitions have been filed in North Dakota federal court this past year, all within the last 3 months. What exactly are these emergency petitions asking judges to do?
Most of them are asking judges to order ICE to allow these detainees to request bond hearings. So up until fairly recently, if you were an immigrant detained by immigration agents inside the United States and were accused of being undocumented, you could usually request to go before an immigration judge for a bond hearing and potentially be released from detention if you could convince them that you didn't pose a risk of, fleeing, or you didn't pose a threat to the public. And this practice came from guidance from the Department of Justice. However, last year, the executive branch came out and said that this guidance was wrong, and they took the position that federal law actually requires these immigrants to be detained basically for the duration of their immigration proceedings. And so, of course, naturally, a lot of people disagree with this stance, and they think that the administration is breaking the law, and so they're filing these lawsuits to ask federal judges to review their cases and to intervene and order ICE to allow these people the opportunity to have bond hearings.
Do we know, Mary, whether the people that you've reported about who have filed these petitions are, in fact, North Dakota residents?
I've looked at the court documents, and it seems like most of them are. If my memory serves me correctly, there was one instance where the individual who was detained in Minnesota, and I think there was one lawsuit where it was ambiguous. I couldn't glean from the documents if they for sure lived in North Dakota, but most of them appear to be people living in North Dakota.
One striking detail, at least it was striking to me, is that the legal system in what you're reporting about doesn't guarantee counsel in these immigration proceedings. That was a surprise to me. How significant is that?
It's my understanding that people don't have a right to representation in civil proceedings, and immigration charges are civil violations. So a lot of these people go unrepresented, and I think that's significant because just of the stakes involved here. And additionally, a lot of these people may not speak English or may not speak very much English, let alone understand the law, which, most of us do not. I certainly do not. And navigating immigration laws is extraordinarily complex. So just like most people are sort of at a disadvantage if they don't have an attorney, that could certainly apply here too.
Tell me who Sue Swanson is and how she described all of this, kind of like you just spoke about, learning as she goes.
So Sue is one of the few full-time immigration attorneys in the state, and She says she believes she's the only one admitted to practice in federal court. And so she was the only attorney out of the 7 petitions I reviewed who was a North Dakota attorney who brought these challenges to ICE detentions. And it was her first time doing so, she said. That, even though she has practiced in federal court before, this was a very unique situation. And of course, like with federal immigration policies changing so quickly, she said she had never been in a situation where she had to do this before. And so, thus, she said she's been having to learn as she goes.
Mary, you report that federal judges in North Dakota have ruled differently on the question of these bond hearings. And can you explain what changed in federal policy regarding bond eligibility? I think you touched on that earlier, but what is the reason that judges are ruling differently?
So there have been a few different rulings. The main 2 positions of our federal courts that have kind of diverged is like on the interpretation of the federal laws that dictate what should happen to someone who's been accused of being in the country illegally. And so basically, like, the difference is whether or not the judges agree with the federal government's position. Our judges, Daniel Hovland and Peter Welty, have issued rulings that indicate that they disagree with the federal government's position. And then Judge Dan Traynor, who has only, actually, let me correct that, has mostly taken cases from Minnesota just because they've had such a high volume of these petitions. He's agreed with the federal government stance. And in the specific cases that Judge Hovland and Judge Traynor have ruled on, they've like sort of provided in-depth analyses of like what they think the statute actually says. That's not exactly the case for Judge Welty. So the case he ruled on, he issued an order to grant a request for a bond hearing just because the Department of Justice had actually failed to meet a court-imposed deadline to respond to the lawsuit. And so in his opinion, he indicated that he thought the plaintiff's claims seemed like they had merit, but that really the grounds for him granting the request was just that the Department of Justice hadn't met the deadline that they were supposed to.
Mary, you were telling me offline that in order to research some of these rulings, that you just can't do it online from where you're at. You have to go to a particular place in a courthouse. Tell me about that.
Yeah, so I asked the federal court clerk about this. So she said, if I'm summarizing her correctly, that in certain cases, including some immigration cases and social security cases, courts make it a little bit harder for the general public to view documents. And so they're still technically public, but you have to go to a terminal, like a computer, in the courthouse to view them. And the idea behind that is that these cases are a little bit more sensitive than normal. And so they just put that barrier there so that people can only see them, if they're really looking for them. And so I've had to go to the courthouse, especially probably at least once a day last week. And luckily our office is like really close by. It's like a 2-minute walk. But because these cases are moving so quickly, I really, I would kind of watch the docket like a hawk. And if I saw there was an update, I usually had to walk up the street, go through security, ride the elevator up, boot up the terminal to check what was going on.
We're enjoying our conversation with Mary Stoyer in our weekly conversation called A Closer Look with the Monitor. Today, we're talking about immigration enforcement and the growing number of ICE detention cases that are now moving through federal court right here in North Dakota. Of course, Mary, this has impacted communities nationwide and even here in North Dakota. And your reporting includes reactions from attorneys and nonprofit leaders who say fear is growing even here. What are you hearing from these folks and from their families as well?
I haven't talked to a lot of people directly, although the few conversations I've had with attorneys and people involved with nonprofits that help new Americans, um, they are saying that even though ICE doesn't really have a very visible presence in North Dakota, certainly like nothing like it is in Minneapolis, that people are seeing what's going on and they're really afraid that they could get targeted. And this was sort of regardless of immigration status, is what I heard from some of the people I spoke to, just because there have been reports of people with legal status ending up in detention. And so there's just sort of an overarching atmosphere of fear and uncertainty.
Mary, there are so many elements to a story like this. What surprised you most in your reporting about these ICE detentions that are happening right here, and then these actions that are happening right here in North Dakota?
So, one element that I don't think I really had either the space, or maybe it just like wasn't really super relevant to the story. One element that I didn't really address is that in pretty much every case, the plaintiffs were asking the judges to order that they don't be like spirited away to a detention center in another state while the case was pending. And so I really felt kind of the urgency of the cases while I was trying to watch them, just like in, by searching them up in court records. I was surprised by how quickly the attorneys would try to move, like after a detention happened. In some cases, they told me that they would have to sacrifice a lot of sleep to make sure that they would get the filing in before their client could potentially be moved to a detention center in like Texas or Louisiana or something. And so, I mean, I had heard that was happening sort of in national media, but just like the pressure, and in some cases like the impossible demands on some of these attorneys to try to like act quickly enough for their clients was just very striking to me.
The other thing I wonder about is, as you reported and as you said earlier, there aren't many immigration attorneys that are even there to help. So that makes it even probably more time sensitive for a lot of folks who find themselves in this position.
Yeah, I really didn't know, and I still pretty much know nothing about the immigration system because it's so complex, but I had no reference point for, what a typical immigration attorney does or doesn't do in their day-to-day lives. And so the idea, that there are so few in the state, and they really never have been put in a position to have to know how to do this before, I think was also not necessarily surprising, I suppose, just because, like I said, I have never had to think about it before. The fact that even among the attorneys who do this for a living, they've never had to file these types of lawsuits in federal court. And so they're sort of starting from zero. Not starting from zero, but taking up a new, an entirely new skill for sure.
And it all needs to happen, as you said, very, very quickly. That's Mary Stoyer. She's a reporter with the North Dakota Monitor. You can read her and her colleagues' awesome reporting on ICE detention cases and many other things about our state government and other legal developments at northdakotamonitor.com. Mary, thank you for helping us take a closer look.
Thank you.
And that's this week's A Closer Look with the Monitor. You can always read the North Dakota Monitor online without paywalls or subscriptions at northdakotamonitor.com.